The first time they parked that crane on my driveway, I honestly thought it was a mistake. I mean, who just rolls 40 tons of steel onto somebody else's property like it's no big deal? But looking back now, I think that moment told me everything I needed to know about the kind of people I was dealing with. My name's Daniel Mercer, and up until last year, my life was pretty quiet. I lived in a little neighborhood outside Tacoma, Washington, on a dead-end street where nothing ever really happened. The kind of place where people wave from their porches, mow their lawns on Saturdays, and complain about raccoons getting into the trash like it's breaking news. My house wasn't anything fancy, just a one-story place my dad left me after he passed. But it was mine. Every inch of it, especially that gravel driveway. That driveway mattered more to me than people probably realize. My dad built it himself back in the late 80s. I still remember helping him spread gravel when I was a kid, me carrying little buckets like I was doing something important while he pretended not to redo all my work afterward. So yeah, maybe I was a little attached to it. Then came the developers. About 8 months ago, this company called Holloway Urban Development bought the empty lot next door. Nobody liked the news, but around here people mostly keep their heads down. We figured maybe they'd build a duplex or something small. Nope, 3-story apartment complex, 32 units. Underground plumbing work started first, then concrete trucks, then framing crews, the generators humming before sunrise every morning like we were living beside an airport runway. At first, I tried being patient. Progress is progress, right? That's what everybody says until progress starts rattling your windows at 6 in the morning. Still, I kept my mouth shut. The workers were mostly decent guys. A couple of them even waved at me when I got the mail. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed. I backed my truck out of the garage, coffee in one hand, half asleep, and suddenly slammed the brakes so hard I spilled hot coffee all over my jeans. There was a giant yellow crane sitting across my driveway like it owned the place. Not near my driveway, on it, 2 massive stabilizer legs planted directly into the gravel. One of them just feet from my garage entrance. The crane operator was up there casually swinging steel beams over the construction site like this was perfectly normal. I sat there for a second thinking, no way. There's no way they think this is okay. So I parked on the lawn and walked over to the site supervisor. Big guy named Rick Donnelly, mid-50s, wraparound sunglasses, clipboard permanently attached to his hand like he thought he was running the Pentagon instead of a construction site. I kept it polite. Hey man, I said, your crane's blocking my driveway. He barely looked up. Yeah, just temporary. Temporary turned out to be his favorite word. I told him I needed to leave for work. He finally glanced over, then shrugged like I'd asked him to move a mountain. The street's too tight, he said. Driveway's the only workable angle. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile either. One of those little smug smiles people use when they already decided your problem doesn't matter. We'll be done in a bit. A bit turned into 6 hours. I missed a contractor meeting across town because they trapped my truck in the garage all day. And here's the thing that really got under my skin. Nobody apologized. Not one person. By the time the crane finally moved out around sunset, Rick just gave me a lazy little wave like we were buddies now. Next morning, same thing. Crane back on my driveway by 7:15. Third morning, again. By the fourth day, it stopped feeling like construction and started feeling personal. My neighbor Evelyn noticed it too. Sweet older woman across the street, retired school teacher, always watering flowers at exactly 5 o'clock every evening like it was part of a military routine. She walked over while I was staring at the crane one afternoon and said, Danny, those men think they own this whole street now. And honestly, she wasn't wrong. That night I pulled my property survey out of a filing cabinet in the garage. I spread it across my kitchen table and stared at it for almost an hour while the sound of generators droned outside through the walls. The property line was crystal clear. The entire driveway belonged to me. No easement, no shared access, nothing, which meant every morning they parked that crane there. They were trespassing. And the craziest part? I don't think they cared. I think they assumed I'd just keep tolerating it because one guy in an old house doesn't stand up to $1 million development project. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not anger exactly. Something colder than that. Because when somebody treats your home like it's disposable, eventually you stop trying to be the reasonable guy in the conversation. The next morning, I started documenting everything. Not in some dramatic movie villain way either. I just got methodical about it. Every day before work, I'd walk outside with my phone, take pictures of the crane, the stabilizer legs, the tire marks cutting into my gravel. Then I'd screenshot the timestamp and save it all into a folder labeled Holloway. After about a week, that folder started looking less like random complaints and more like evidence. Meanwhile, the construction kept getting worse. They brought in brighter floodlights, louder generators, bigger crews. One morning, I opened my front door and found a stack of plywood leaning against my fence like they'd forgotten where their property ended and mine began. Another time, one of the laborers actually parked his pickup halfway across my lawn while unloading pipes. When I told him to move it, the guy just laughed and said, "Relax, old man. The grass grows back." I was 42. Apparently, construction sites age you fast. But the thing that really pushed me over the edge happened on a Friday afternoon. My younger sister Claire came by to visit with her little boy, Noah. Kid's 8 years old, obsessed with dinosaurs and monster trucks, non-stop energy from the second he wakes up. They pulled into the driveway just as the crane operator started lifting a steel beam overhead. I watched this massive piece of steel swing right above Claire's SUV while Noah was still climbing out of the back seat. I remember my chest tightening because suddenly this wasn't about inconvenience anymore. One mistake, one snapped cable, and somebody dies. Claire saw my face and immediately knew something was wrong. "Danny," she said quietly, "this can't be legal." That night I barely slept. I kept hearing the clanging metal from the site echoing through the walls, and somewhere around 2 in the morning I got out of bed, drove downtown, and sat outside a 24-hour diner drinking terrible coffee while reading city construction codes on my phone like a maniac. And that's when things got interesting. Turns out Tacoma has very specific regulations about equipment staging and emergency access. Heavy machinery had to remain inside approved operating zones. Blocking private access points without authorization? Huge violation. Blocking the only access route to a residential garage? Even worse. There were liability issues, fire code issues, emergency vehicle concerns. Suddenly, this wasn't just me being annoyed by a crane. This was a legal problem. Monday morning, I went straight to City Hall. Now, if you've never dealt with a permit office before, let me tell you something. Those places move with all the urgency of a tranquilized sloth. Beige walls, flickering fluorescent lights, people waiting in uncomfortable plastic chairs slowly losing the will to live. But eventually, I ended up sitting across from this woman named Sandra Kim, one of the permit coordinators. Sharp eyes, no-nonsense attitude. Looked like the kind of person who'd heard every excuse on earth at least twice. I explained the situation and handed her my photos. At first, she looked bored. Then she saw the timestamps. Then the repeated violations. Then the survey map. Her expression changed immediately. She leaned back in her chair and said, "They've been doing this every day?" "Pretty much." She zoomed in on one photo where the stabilizer legs sat almost 3 feet inside my property line. "Did they ask permission?" I actually laughed. "No." Sandra disappeared into a back office for about 15 minutes. When she came back, she had a thick permit file in her hand. She flipped through pages, stopped, frowned, then turned the file toward me. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "their approved staging zone ends here." Her finger tapped the edge of the construction lot. My driveway wasn't even close to it. "So, what happens now?" I asked. Sandra gave me this tiny little smile that honestly scared me a little. "Now," she said, "we verify." Tuesday afternoon, 2 city inspectors showed up while the crane was operating again. And buddy, you should have seen Rick's face when those city trucks pulled up. It was like watching somebody realize halfway through a poker game that they'd been bluffing against the wrong person. The inspectors didn't waste time. One guy measured distances while the other took photographs from every angle imaginable. They checked permit diagrams, property markers, emergency clearance whips. Meanwhile, the crane operator just sat frozen in the cab staring down at everybody like a kid who got caught cheating on a test. Rick walked over trying to play it cool. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he said with this fake confidence that was almost painful to watch. "Minor access issue. We're handling it." One inspector didn't even look up from his clipboard. "You've been operating outside your approved zone for 12 consecutive days." Rick's smile disappeared. "Well, the street configuration doesn't override permit restrictions." Cold, flat, final. I was standing on my porch pretending not to enjoy this too much. Evelyn, of course, was openly enjoying it. She had somehow materialized beside her mailbox with binoculars and iced tea, like this was the Super Bowl. The inspectors spent another 10 minutes walking the site. Then one of them made a phone call. That was the moment the energy changed completely. Suddenly, workers stopped moving around so casually. Conversations got quieter. Rick kept rubbing the back of his neck like he could physically massage the panic away. Then finally, the lead inspector walked over to him and handed him a bright orange paper. Even from my porch, I could read the top line. Temporary. Stop work order. Man, the silence after that hit differently. Generators shut down. The crane lowered its hook. Workers just stood there looking around awkwardly while traffic backed up behind the equipment truck trying to leave. And for the first time in almost 2 weeks, my driveway was empty. Rick came marching across my yard about 20 minutes later, not walking, marching, his boots digging holes into my grass the whole way over. Happy now, he snapped before I could even say hello. I stayed calm. Honestly, little bit. He pointed back toward the site. You got any idea how much this shutdown's costing us? Probably less than a lawsuit if somebody got hurt. That answer made him furious. His face turned red instantly. This project brings housing into this community, he said. Jobs, business, progress. Progress doesn't mean you get to use my property whenever you feel like it. He stepped closer then, close enough I could smell coffee and cigarette smoke on his jacket. He could have just talked to us. I actually stared at him for a second because I couldn't believe he said that with a straight face. Rick, I said quietly. I did. That shut him up. For maybe 3 whole seconds. Then he shook his head and muttered, "People like you are why projects get delayed," and there it was. That sentence right there. Not an apology. Not accountability. In his mind, I was the problem for refusing to let a corporation walk over me. He stormed off after that, yelling at somebody before he even crossed back onto the construction lot. That evening, the neighborhood felt weirdly peaceful. No generators. No beeping, forklifts. Just wind moving through trees again. I sat on my porch with a beer while the sunset hit the unfinished apartment frame next door. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could actually hear myself think. But deep down, I also knew this wasn't over, because guys like Rick don't like losing, especially not to somebody they already decided was smaller than them. The shutdown lasted 3 days, 3 very tense, very quiet days where the entire construction site just sat there half-finished like a giant metal skeleton baking in the rain. And if I'm being honest, part of me expected retaliation. Not anything crazy, but little things. Nails in my driveway, trash blowing into my yard, somebody accidentally backing into my fence at 2 in the morning. When you challenge people with money on the line, your brain starts imagining all kinds of scenarios. But none of that happened. What happened instead was almost stranger. Thursday morning, around 8, there was a knock at my door. I opened it, and there stood Rick. Except this version of Rick looked very different from the guy who'd been stomping across my lawn 2 days earlier. No sunglasses, no attitude, just tired eyes and a folder tucked under his arm. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then he sighed and rubbed his jaw. "Can we talk?" We ended up sitting on my porch like 2 divorced dads waiting for a baseball game to start. And for the first time since this whole thing began, he talked to me like an actual human being instead of an obstacle. Turns out the delay had triggered penalties from investors. Equipment rentals were costing them thousands a day. Subcontractors had to be rescheduled. Concrete pours got pushed back because the crane inspection had to be redone under city supervision. Every extra day burned money. Corporates losing their minds, he admitted quietly. They think I mishandled the site. I looked over at him and almost laughed at the understatement of the century. But then, something unexpected happened. He stopped talking like a foreman and started talking like a tired middle-aged guy who'd been getting screamed at by executives all week. "Look," he said, staring out at the street. "You know how these projects work? Everybody's rushing all the time. Deadlines, budgets, inspections. After a while, people stop seeing neighborhoods. They see logistics." That line stuck with me, because weirdly enough, I believed him. I don't think Rick woke up every morning trying to bully homeowners. I think somewhere along the line he just got used to steamrolling people because most people eventually gave in. And honestly, most of the time that system probably worked, just not this time. He opened the folder and handed me a revised site operations map. The crane had been repositioned completely inside their property line now. It made the lift angles tighter and slowed material movement way down. But technically it worked. Barely. That he approved it this morning, he said. No more driveway issues. I studied the map for a second, then nodded. Should have done that from the start. He gave this tired little half smile. Yeah, probably. And right there, the whole thing could have ended cleanly. Nice little lesson learned. Handshake, mutual respect. Roll credits. But life's usually messier than that. Because once construction restarted, the delays got worse. Way worse. Without access to my driveway, crane movements took almost twice as long. Deliveries had to be staggered. Workers started falling behind schedule. Then winter rain hit early, which turned the site into a muddy disaster zone for weeks. Rumors started spreading around the neighborhood that Holloway Urban Development lost nearly $2 million on the project by the time everything was finished. Now, whether that number was real or neighborhood gossip inflated by boredom, I honestly don't know. But I do know this. Corporate stopped sending executives to the site after a while. And Rick? He disappeared halfway through the build. One of the electricians told me he got reassigned after the driveway incident. Funny how one small decision can follow somebody around like that. The apartment building finally opened about 2 months late. Young professionals moved in. New cars lined the street. And honestly, the building itself didn't even look bad once it was done. Modern siding, little balconies, overpriced rent probably. The neighborhood changed, but not in the apocalyptic way everybody feared. Some changes were good. Coffee shop opened nearby. Property values went up. Evelyn started calling the tenants the yoga people because apparently every new resident owned either a bicycle, a yoga mat, or both. But the funniest part came a few weeks after construction ended. I was walking my trash cans back up the driveway one evening when I noticed a brand new metal sign bolted onto the side fence near the construction entrance. White background, red capital letters, construction vehicles must remain inside property lines at all times. I just stood there staring at it for a solid minute before I started laughing. Real deep laughing too. The kind where you bend over a little because you can't help it. After everything that happened, after all the money, delays, inspections, arguments, somebody at Holloway had actually turned my driveway into an official policy reminder. And the crazy thing is, I still think about the whole situation more than I probably should. Not because of the crane or the permits or even the fight itself, but because it forced me to realize something uncomfortable about people. Most conflicts don't start with evil. They start with convenience. Somebody decides your boundary is inconvenient. Your time is inconvenient. Your property is inconvenient. And they convince themselves it's okay to ignore it just this once. Then they act shocked when you finally push back. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just stayed quiet. Maybe the project finishes on time. Maybe nobody gets fined. Maybe Rick keeps his assignment. But then again, maybe people keep treating my home like it doesn't matter. And after my dad spent half his life building that place with his own hands, I don't think I could live with that. So yeah, maybe shutting down an entire apartment project over a driveway sounds petty to some people. Maybe they think I should have just let it slide for the sake of progress. But I'll tell you this, if progress only works when ordinary people surrender their boundaries, then maybe it deserves to slow down once in a while. And honestly, I'm curious where you land on this. Was I justified for reporting them, or did I take things too far over a temporary inconvenience? Because depending on who you ask in my neighborhood, I'm either the guy who stood up to a corporation or the stubborn jerk who delayed housing during a market shortage. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with neighbors, developers, or companies crossing boundaries they had no right to cross, share your story too. Trust me, I read every single one.